I want to back up in a way and talk about a conceptual difficulty within the movements. In fact, I mean, I'm really excited about, and I'm happy to be here, excited to be here in Copenhagen because it seems to me like a new beginning within the life and the cycles of the movements. But it seems to me that there is at least conceptual difficulty that we have to work through, and that's what I want to pose. And what I'm thinking about, and this is in a way one of the questions the organizers had who were organizing this event, is the relationship between climate struggles and a certain tradition of anti-capitalist struggles that we've seen for the last 10, 15 years. And so let me start at a conceptual level, and then I'll try to get into something, and I think it'll make sense to you enough. It seems to me what links the struggles against climate change to the whole series of other social struggles is the advocacy of the common, or the defense of the common, the struggle for the common. The common here is configured as a response to and a cure, in a way, to neoliberalism, or really an alternative to the rule of property. So one major strategy of neoliberalism has been precisely privatization, and privatization of the common, privatization of the forests, of the oceans, the land, of species of animals, genetic code, also indigenous knowledges, music, ideas, etc. And so this dedication to the common, in a way, unites the struggles, these struggles against climate change, with a whole other series of social struggles, anti-capitalist struggles. But as soon as one tries to define the common in this notion in more detail, it becomes clear that there are really two forms of the common which have very different characteristics. And these two forms of the common mark a division, or at least a conceptual division, among the movements gathered here in Copenhagen. And this is what I want to talk about. In a way, so I'm not really, what I think I'm posing is a false problem, but a very persistent false problem that we have to address, and what I think is happening in these days is starting to address it. So give me a minute and I'll explain what I see as this problem. So it starts with these two notions of the common, which I think are somewhat different even if we're united. The first notion of the common I'm thinking of as what traditionally in English is thought of as the commons with an S. In other words, the earth, the air, the water, the forests that we share. And that these, of course, are destroyed when they're transformed into private property, and we're seeing ever new ways of constructing private property, carbon trading, for instance, creating markets out of very difficult to define commodities. But that we can see that struggle between the common and property, the common and these markets. But the primary characteristic of this notion of the common is its limits, the logic of scarcity. This water that's used for this hydroelectric power in this dam can't be used for farming. Or there are limits to the earth, there are limits to the atmosphere. And we know all that from the technical, and becomes a very technical discussion office. So that the climate struggles, like others focused on this first notion of the common, must insist on the limits, on the recognition of these limits, on creating justice within these limits, etc. But then there's also a second notion of the common, and this is actually what I've spent most of my time thinking about in the last 10 years. And I'm thinking of the common here as the product of human creativity, the product of human production. For instance, thinking about ideas as common, images, information, code, forms of life, social relations, even affects. These are, in a way, common. And these too are destroyed or at least diminished when privatized. In other words, they need to be shared to be productive. Code needs to be shared in order to be productive, knowledge, etc. And so there again, there's a struggle between the common and property. I mean, think of biopiracy, for instance, which is the making of private property out of traditional indigenous knowledges, say the knowledge of the medicinal uses of a plant or of a tree. If it's made into private property, it's removed from its common context and destroyed in its common productivity. I have to actually object to calling this piracy, biopiracy. I mean, it ruins the dignity of pirates. Because at least pirates steal property. They steal private property. I wish they would make it common, but they don't always. But what biopiracy is really stealing the common and making it into property, which seems to be something different and worse. But nonetheless, this second notion of the common is really characterized by a lack of limits, and not by a logic of scarcity. In other words, with the, say, productivity of ideas or of knowledges, the fact that you use an idea that I have doesn't make it less valuable to me. In fact, it only makes it more valuable. Or affects or social relations or forms of life you can see that this form of the common is really unlimited and characterized by that reproducibility. So that struggles that focus on this notion of the common, and I think the most interesting anti-capitalist struggles of the last 10 years, are characterized by unlimited demands and unlimited desires, in contrast to the limits and the insistence on limits of the first notion of the common. Are you seeing where I'm going here? So you can see it in the slogans. For instance, what I thought was one of the best post-Seattle slogans, my favorite really, we want everything for everyone. Now, in the context of the second notion of the common, that makes a lot of sense, and it's a notion of justice. In the context of the first notion of the common, we want everything for everyone doesn't strike the same way because it doesn't recognize the limits. In the same way that one of my favorite placards from Saturday was, there is no planet B. In a way, there is no alternative. But that functions within the context of the first notion of the common. In the notion of the second, it sounds a little bit like a Thatcherite neoliberalist, there is no alternative. So that what I'm trying to point out is a kind of disjunctions, or rather, another world is possible. Sometimes in the context of the first notion of the common, you might have to say, well, this world is still possible, maybe. And so what I'm trying to point in way too starkly, but to two conceptions of the common that are tied to two traditions of struggle, and to recognize that, what I'm hoping that you recognize is conflicts among comrades that in a way belong to one tradition more than another, or even conflicts within yourself. In fact, that's what generates my thinking about this, is I find conflicts in myself about trying to understand this as a hurdle. I think, in fact, this is a false problem. But it's a persistent false problem. It's one, like false problems aren't, you can't just, like I can't wave my magic wand and resolve these kind of false problems. They have to be resolved politically and in movements. Like for instance, 10 years ago we faced a different kind of false problem, it seems to me. We faced a false problem about the global and the local. Like in other words, in the post-Seattle years, it was constantly portrayed by the media, but also I think internal to ourselves, the notion that if you're against the globalization of McDonald's and Starbucks and the other major corporations, then you're against the global and you're insisting on the local, that you're anti-globalization. Well, it took many years for the movements to work through and develop a substantial notion of an alter globalization that resolves the false problem of the global and the local. And I think that what we're facing today, or what we're seeing in these days in Copenhagen, or that's what I expect from Copenhagen, is to begin to overcome this and really other false problems of the movements today. So we need, it seems to me, we need a movement characterized by, on the one hand, unlimited creativity and desire, and on the other, a defense of the limited earth we share, or rather, an invention of a just means to share this earth. The unlimited nature of the one can't really conflict with the limited nature of the other. And so this is what I'm hoping that these days in Copenhagen can be the beginning of. The beginning to rid ourselves of such false problems so that we can confront the real problems together. Thanks.